I'm here with Eric Johnston from the Southeast Law Institute, and I'm really grateful for your willingness to talk to us. You were one of the people who really helped to write the Alabama Vulnerable Child Protection Act, the VCAP legislation that almost passed last year, which would protect children from getting experimental invasive treatments for gender identity issues. And I wanted to talk to you to find out, first of all, how you respond to some of the arguments against this kind of legislation, and also to find out what your plans are moving forward for 2021.
Yes, I'll be glad to answer your questions and discuss this with you. Thank you.
Sure. I think one of the biggest questions that I have, and that probably is something that would really help for you to address, is the parental rights issue. Because this legislation, in some ways, it empowers parents because it allows them to fight back against the trans movement that's pushing these invasive and harmful interventions. But there are people who would suggest that they actually take away parents' rights, because there are some parents who really want to give these treatments, puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery to children. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think there's this idea that because the parents are involved, it's okay. They give their permission. Like you get your ears pierced, so it's, you get a tattoo, you get parental permission to do that. Of course, this is an entirely different situation where you have a very invasive surgical procedure ultimately. You have different drugs and things administered leading up to that, and it's life-changing, and it's very difficult to change. So you have this idea that the advocates for this type thing put forward is that, beginning with the hormone blockers and so forth, these are reversible. These are drugs that have been around a long time. They don't do any harm, but they do. And so I'm not a doctor, so I don't talk about the medical evidence, but that is the basis for the reason that they say that parents can get involved and give permission to do these things, is because these are harmless things. And in Alabama, we know at this point that no surgical procedures are being done, but I think over time, the therapies that are being done by endocrinologists here will lead to that. And so we'll have, major kind of surgeries done on children. Now the question is, can parents give their consent for that type of thing to be done? Well, if it's a harmless procedure, like getting your ears pierced, yes, I think they could. But the medical evidence is no, it's not a harmless procedure, and parents cannot authorize or give permission for their children to do things which is against their health. And we can talk a little more about the legalities of those things, but generally that's, I think, the argument that we've been hearing and kind of the basic response to it.
And I think that that's something that people really need to understand, and it's confusing because activists have suggested that these are well-proven treatments that will help these kids. Based on my research, I haven't found any evidence of that. Do you have any evidence about the harms of these interventions?
Well, I know that the medical testimony that I've heard in the documentation that I've read is that it is harmful. And so if it's harmful, should it be regulated? That's the legal question that's presented to the legislature with legislation like the VCAP legislation.
Well, and it's interesting. I don't know if you heard, today is Tuesday, and in the United Kingdom, they just announced that Curabell, who was suing the National Health Service there, won her case, and that England will no longer be allowed to give puberty blockers to children under 16. One of the things I hear over and over again is that these kinds of things don't happen to children, that puberty blockers aren't given till kids are older, that cross-sex hormones aren't given till kids are older, and that surgeries don't happen until kids are over 18. And we know this isn't true. And the fact that the United Kingdom just basically said that the National Health Service isn't allowed to do this anymore is an indication of how harmful these are, and the fact that they do give them to children. What kind of response do you have to people who say this isn't really an issue? These are just activists who are trying to push their transphobic legislation on us.
Well, I think Europe really leads us on the new wave of things that are being done, not only with COVID. They have problems, and then we have problems. I think they've had the sex change therapies and operations done more than here. In other words, they're head office with it. And I think they've realized now that it is a problem and they're addressing that problem. So I think that's instructive to us that we need to say, well, we see what's happening there. We know how these things happen. They do it first and then we learn from it because they're a little more liberal in their attitudes on these things. I mean, it's a whole lot of reasons for it. But ultimately, I think we see what they do and we need to look at it very closely. And I think they've probably made the right move and we need to be aware of that and learn from it.
I agree. They definitely started these interventions sooner, so they have more body of evidence of the harms, which is why I think that the courts decided that they needed to ban these treatments for really young children, for children under 16. How do you respond to someone who says this is between the family and their doctor and their child, and that the state does not have a right to interfere with decisions in the privacy of a doctor's office?
If it's a harmless medical procedure, then you should not have the right. I mean, if you take your child in to get a flu shot, and some people say, we don't want to get those kind of shots, or even say the COVID vaccination, some don't want to get it, parents might make that decision. But in this kind of a case where we know there's medical evidence that supports the damage that it can do, and again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not trying to say, what the medicine is on it, but I've heard and read the testimony both from Alabama and in other places about how bad it is and what the long lasting and the side effects are, then it's not a decision that parents ought to be able to make on their own because they're damaging their children. And the children, are, of course, have no rights at that point because the parents determine what their rights are. Ultimately, the damage is done to the child. I think the thing that we have to keep in mind here is that the state of Alabama, the other 49 states, have reserved to them what's called police powers. It's not got anything to do with law enforcement. It's just called police powers. That issue has come up recently, in the COVID crisis. How far can states go to regulate the activity people are doing? It's the same thing here. The state can look at the medical evidence and say, this is something that does not need to be done. And so they can regulate it. And if they regulate it, then the parents have to go along with that law. It's just like any other law. A minor cannot go out and buy alcohol. A parent cannot go buy the alcohol and give it to the minor. That's against the law as well, because that's it's an activity, it's a bad thing. And so the legislature, within that authority that's reserved to them to regulate the public health and the well-being, can pass laws that they believe are just and reasonable and necessary to protect children. And so that's what we're talking about here. We believe the medical evidence is damage can be done to children. Based on that, it's not just a parental decision based on talking with a child and then talking with a doctor. Now, it's true, there's some doctors who advocate this. There are a lot of doctors that advocate a lot of things that we may not agree with. Things like this, they're highly unusual, highly irregular. This is not normal medicine. Some people may call it avant-garde medicine. We're just looking to the future. We're satisfying some people's emotional, and physical needs and things they want to do. But does that make it right for a parent to do it to a child? We're not suggesting that adults can't do it. It still may be a mistake to do it. But when you're an adult, you can go buy alcohol and you can enter into destructive behavior. You can gamble. You can do all kinds of things that the law limits minors from doing, and not allowing parents to authorize minors to do. So I think it's not a decision just between a parent and a healthcare provider who advocates this kind of thing. The state needs to look at the evidence and say, yes, we need to protect minors in this kind of situation.
The state does have an interest in protecting children, and that has been established. So if a child decided that they wanted a lobotomy and their parents were like, yep, we think that would really help calm our child, and they went into a doctor and asked the doctor to give their child a lobotomy, that doctor would not be able to do that. That would be medical malpractice, and the state regulates things like that. So is this a very similar situation?
Sure, I think it would be. And I think maybe a better example is they went in and say, I want my child sterilized. I don't want him having children. Well, you can't do that to the child. That takes away the child's rights ultimately and does irreversible damage that the child couldn't, do those things later in life. Now, later, A lot of, women have hysterectomies and men have vasectomies, but they're adults and they make that decision. But you shouldn't be able to make that decision for a child.
That's a really good point. And it's something that when I was in high school, I did not want children. And I actually approached my doctor and asked him to tie my tubes, and he absolutely refused to do it. Would not even consider it until I was over 25, he said. And so I think that's a really good example that if you have parents who want their child sterilized and the child is like excited about it, any doctor who would actually go ahead and do that would really be violating the Hippocratic Oath.
Well, I've worked on laws that affect healthcare for many, many years, primarily in the abortion area, and then related things involving parental rights and so forth. And I know that we live in a multifaceted culture, and a lot of people have a lot of ideas about what are good things to do and what are bad things to do. And there's a lot of difference of opinion. But I think we have to rely on the medical science to direct, in this case here, the Alabama legislature, on passing a law that will protect minors. Later, if they want to do it as adults, and unless something changes, they'll have the right to do that. But as minors, they need to be protected.
Well, and I think that that's something that we forget, that there's the activists have done a good job of saying that this is evidence-based and it's approved by the FDA and that there are no harms and that it's reversible. But all the scientific reports that I've looked at have showed the opposite. The good science shows that this increases the rates of suicide, that it causes children who are getting these procedures have higher rates of self-harming behavior. Their mental health states go down. So not only are these invasive and harmful procedures in and of themselves, there is no evidence to show that they're effective.
Well, I agree. And, there may be a dispute in the evidence by both sides taking positions on it. I think we saw that in testimony in the Alabama legislature in the session earlier this year. And I think it's probably going to be that way. And in some states, you're going to have more regulation than in other states. At this point, I haven't seen anything that the federal government is going to regulate this, so it's going to be left up to the states. And again, it goes back to this constitutional right of the police power of the state to regulate things it thinks are harmful health-wise to its people. And so we have to present the evidence, and there's going to be arguments. There's going to be both sides of the issue presented. And I think in our health committees, when the evidence was presented in both the Senate and the House, they both voted to pass this law to regulate this activity because they saw that the medical science, maybe it was uncertain, there were some divergent views, but it was overwhelmingly showing that this is a dangerous thing to do.
And I worry a little bit about the term police state because I know what you mean by that. It's a descriptive term, probably a legal term, but it sounds kind of invasive, like police state. And
yeah, well, it's police powers. It's not a police state. As I said earlier, it does not have anything to do with law enforcement by police officers doing their job for protection of the public. The police powers is a constitutional term used by the courts to identify the authority that the state has to exercise healthcare rights. As I said, the COVID problem has demonstrated that to us in many ways because of all the lawsuits and the claims of closing down businesses and vaccinations and all these things that people are confronting. How far can the state go on doing these things? Can there be a mandate to wear masks in some places, even in your own home? Those are exercise of the police powers, and they are not unlimited. So it's a question of the limits. I think in the case here where we're talking about this kind of surgery on minors and kind of hormonal treatment and that type thing, I think that the evidence is pretty clear here that would be within the police power of the state to regulate that behavior for the general welfare of minor children.
Because the state does regulate things like if a parent isn't feeding their child, if a parent is abusing their child, even if you had a parent who was giving a child alcohol, those would all be interests in which the state would get involved to protect the child. So it seems like almost fundamentally this comes down to whether or not these are harming the children, because if they are, then the state has an obligation to protect children.
Every state has a major state apparatus to protect children from child abuse, and it's all kinds of things. Child abuse is not just beating your child with a stick. It is abusing your child, maybe for sexual reasons, for drugs, for alcohol, for abandonment, for just all kinds of things. So you have your departments of human relations and so forth, which go out and investigate, have social workers that investigate things that go on in the home, and children are often taken out of the home because of dangerous situations. So it's clearly within the power of the state to protect children from these kinds of situations.
And one of the things that I've heard some of the activists say is that this is outside activists, outside interests coming into various states to push this anti-transgender agenda. You're from Alabama. Is this true? Is this movement coming from outside interests, or is this homegrown?
No, this is definitely homegrown. We've had some experts who came from, experts always come from out of town. You don't have any local, but that's kind of a joke, that people go by. But no, the experts on the other side are in Alabama, in Birmingham, for instance, at one of the hospitals doing these therapies. So these things are happening in Alabama, and we have pediatricians and other experts here who know that it's wrong. They spent their lives treating children. They know these things are wrong. So this is absolutely homegrown. Everything that we're doing here is from the basis of what's happening in the state of Alabama. The only thing we don't have now that we're aware of is we don't have actual surgeries being done on children. However, I think that will come in time if nothing is done about it, because people will get more and more used to the idea. Right now, if you ask the average citizen about it, and I've talked to a lot of people just in passing, and they all think it's a bad thing to do. It's just very gruesome to think about doing this to children. But as you get accustomed to the idea of it, then it becomes acceptable. And at some point in time, I think the surgeries would be done as well, because we have excellent medical facilities here which can do all kinds of wonderful things. They could easily do these surgeries when the time comes, and what we don't want that to happen, though.
Well, and it's interesting because I've heard the other side suggest that these kind of surgeries do not happen to children, period, not anywhere in the US. And we know that that's not true. We know that there are children as young as 13 who are having mastectomies, and as young as 15 who are having their testicles removed. So we do know it's happening in the US. And I think that your concern that children will be referred to other states is valid. If it's an option, then children will seek to get these surgical procedures outside of Alabama and eventually within Alabama. And it's interesting to me that that the opponents of this legislation suggest these things don't happen. Well, if they don't happen, let's legislate that they can't happen.
Well, that's exactly right. If they don't happen, why worry about it? But we know, as you said, that we know that they have happened in other places, and I think they will happen here. And we just need a law that says, it's not happening now, and we don't want it to happen. It's not a good idea. I think some parents are misunderstanding or misled by healthcare providers who advocate this kind of thing, and they say, well, if your children don't do this, they're going to, their gender's got them all misdirected in their lives, and they're going to commit suicide, and all these terrible things. And the parents rely on healthcare professionals for that. But I think there are advocates for this, and people who are pressing and pushing for this kind of thing to be legal. It's a small number, but it would grow over time. But we need a law now before it becomes a problem to say that this should not be done to children.
It is interesting. I live in Utah, which is another conservative state. And when I talk about this, people will say, oh, that's not happening. You're just making that up. You're just fear mongering. And yet in Utah, when we looked at the number of girls who started to get testosterone at the University of Utah Gender Clinic, it was just this amazing increase from 2017 to 2018 to 2019. The number of girls accessing this treatment has just gone up incredibly. I don't know if you have numbers for how many kids are accessing this treatment in Alabama, because it is very hard to get those numbers. But I know that Lori Herring, who was a RN, called, I think it was the Agawawa Clinic. at the Children's Hospital,
Yes.
and she said that they confirmed that they are giving puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to minors. So it is happening in Alabama.
Oh, it is. Yeah. We proved that. We found that out. But when I first approached legislators about doing this, they said, "Oh no, couldn't be happening." What do you mean? I mean, they were incredulous that this kind of thing would be done to children, and even doctors who in practice were incredulous that it's not done, and it's not being advertised so much. But it is being done, and we know that it's being done, and we don't want it to be done. We don't want it to grow and become commonplace, and the opportunity for parents who are misdirected to advise their children or give permission for their children to do these things. We need the proper medicine to be proven, and then the legislature to act on that to reasonably restrict these kinds of activities. Doesn't mean that you can't get counseling for a child who's got some psychiatric or psychological issues, but we don't want them to counsel them to say, you need to go do a gender change or a sex change and all these other things.
Well, and it's interesting you brought up sterilization, because the ultimate result of these interventions is sterilization. These children who go on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones are going to be sterilized, and children who get their sex organs removed are going to be sterilized. I've talked to young women who are in their mid to late 20s who had these interventions done, and they're devastated because now they realize it was a mistake and they can't have kids, and they're just heartbroken. And I can't imagine if my doctor back when I was in high school went ahead and tied my tubes, because for me, having kids has just been an amazing experience, something that I didn't think I wanted when I was in high school, but it has just had a huge impact. It's been one of the joys of my life. And so I think, if people understood that not only are these treatments harmful, puberty blockers cause joint disease, they cause, developmental delays, the cross-sex hormones cause permanent changes to somebody's appearance, and they also sterilize. This is a tremendous impact to a child who really isn't capable of even consenting to a tattoo or buying alcohol or driving. And yet here we are saying that they're old enough to consent to these kind of irreversible damages that will occur to their bodies.
Well, that's true. And, adults can go and have these surgeries done, but I think the advocates, they want children to have it done so they can have the puberty blockers and begin to change the physiology of the body early enough to make the substantial changes, because when you're an adult, it's more difficult to accomplish these things. So they prey on the children and on the sensibilities of the parents. They need to do this because these children, the interesting thing is this has not been an issue until recent years. Children rather, were not having these crises in their life about whether they were male or female. They grew up a certain way, and some had, maybe effeminate characteristics or masculine characteristics, and some girls were maybe more athletic and so forth. Well, that's true. I mean, there was just a young woman playing for Vanderbilt who, played in a football game, first time in a major college. You know, she wasn't a boy. They didn't change to a boy. She was just physically able to do it. And a lot of girls are that way. But it was not a crisis over whether they're a man or a woman. I mean, I'm sure, well, I don't know this lady, but I'm sure that she probably thinks she's a woman. So,
Well,
we just don't,
yeah.
this new phenomenon, people just kind of say, well, it's something's happening. We just need to change
Yeah,
our
and it
children.
is really, when I look at the literature, it really does look like a social contagion, sort of this, something that started out as a fad, but now is just causing tremendous harms to our children. So I appreciate all your efforts. Is there anything that you wanted to mention that we didn't cover yet?
No, I think we covered it quite well. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your efforts. I know that you're planning on proposing this legislation in the upcoming legislative session, and hopefully people will understand the issue more, because I think, as you said, so many legislators didn't even know this was happening. So your efforts hopefully are raising awareness, and I'm excited that Alabama might be the first state to ban these harmful treatments.
Well, it was well received last year, and I think well understood. Of course, the COVID crisis stopped our session early. It would have passed last year had it not been for that. And we're, ambivalent about the coming session. It starts, right after the first of the year, and we still expect to have some restrictions. So that would be, I think, the only thing that will impede getting this passed. Otherwise, I think it's going to do well in Alabama.
Well, thank you so much for all your efforts, and thank you for your time today.
You're very welcome.
It
Thank you.
was great talking to you.